It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invite, and great to be part of this panel. In the interest of time, I'm going to move quickly, but Kat, before she fell ill, can you all hear me? Great. She invited us to present a case to try and sort of thematically, I guess, organize our arguments around something. So my case is against this blanket approach to empathy. It was also part of a challenge I set myself to represent to include as many mentions to empathy in a single slide as possible. So there it is. Hopefully what I hope to do is basically talk you through my involvement with it, why I called the VR and AR production company that I started, Empathetic Media, as well as, I guess, dismantle some misconceptions, perhaps, and some of the experiments that I've been doing as part of a Tau research fellowship at Columbia University. So this is actually a screenshot. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more of the first VR piece I did called Ferguson Firsthand. It was a reconstruction in CG, as you can see, of the Canfield Green Apartments complex where Michael Brown was shot. But essentially, it spatializes the idea of the scene and how we can build user agency into storytelling and encourage people to sort of navigate their own way through space. But I got my start in a little sort of more of an analog format. This is actually a live sketch from earlier today. It doesn't do Jessica Brilhart much justice. You can see her in the middle there. But as a cartoonist. And fundamentally, I think there's a lot to take away from that similar sort of hand-drawn approach. I actually got into cartooning mainly as a journalist, to establish a dialogue with my subjects by dint of it being a slower, more deliberate process. They could also see how they were being represented, and it always fosters more of a conversation because there's this guy standing in front of people, slowly drawing them, and I represent their direct quotes as speech balloons. So building on a rich tradition, obviously, that goes centuries back, Gilray, Cruikshank, Rowlandson, but also people like Joe Sacco, one of the real pioneers and legends who I encourage you to check out. But fundamentally, there are always issues around representation as well when it came to comics, and particularly VR, obviously. Sometimes subjects were so sensitive and traumatizing for people that they didn't want to be in front of a camera, or they didn't, there was stigma attached to, for example, some of the survivors of human trafficking that I've interviewed. So comics became that way of preserving their identity. So at the level of form, however, really what was interesting for me and comics is that fundamentally they allow the users to, it affords the user a great deal more agency in the sense of how they understand a series of sequential images. And that really was when the barriers to technology became much more accessible for VR, I sort of saw the translation as much more sort of organic. So in terms of Ferguson, I was a Reynolds Journalism Institute fellow in 2014, and I arrived in Columbia, Missouri, like 10 days before Michael Brown was tragically shot. And I immediately, from all the sort of controversy and the coverage of it, I immediately realized that fundamentally what was at stake here was the sense of space and how that was a critical part of understanding this series of events that happened. And so I went down there and took a great deal of photo references, spoke to people, obviously, and then converted it using the Unity game engine, we've heard a lot of talk around Unity, into this area that users can explore. The idea being that by traveling through different beacons, you can effectively unlock pieces of eyewitness testimonies from the grand jury trial, and obviously getting around the question of the Uncanny Valley because the testimonies were submitted anonymously. So it was building on FOIA request evidence, photographic evidence, and as you can see here, this is probably the best way for you to see. This is just a recorded version, if it plays, of the spherical video, so I just saved a spherical video inside, walking through it.
Soon after Michael Brown was fatally shot by police officer Darren Wilson. Your goal is to explore the environment by walking into 3 different kinds of beacons. Colored beacons will display comics of the eyewitness testimonies that were broadcast by the media immediately after the shooting. White beacons will display photos of the evidence gathered by forensic investigators.
So you get a sense of how the scene is comprised, the sort of the relative space, as well as giving users fundamentally the ability to make their own sense of the scene. So we didn't crowbar a narrative into this. We just said, this is where all the evidence is. It's up to you to explore, spend as much time as you want, and try and construct a narrative that way. I'm very aware of the sensitivities around this. Damon brought up an interesting point around effective rank outsiders like myself coming to these places and representing the spaces in this way. But for me, what's interesting about a game engine build, particularly in what pertains to journalism, is that in a 3D space, rather than just slapping a coda or an addendum or a corrective after the article's been published, you can do a new build. And so now that I have the assets, I hope that it fosters a sense of sort of collaboration, and we can repurpose the assets and sort of build a sense of how this location isn't defined by an incident that happened 2 years ago. So moving along. This is, again, a work in progress for a piece that I'm doing on restorative justice in Colombia, situating the user inside 3 different perspectives: a former paramilitary, a demobilized FARC guerrilla fighter, and a civilian, recorded in Spanish. Again, I understand there are constraints because we're deploying to Google Cardboard and Gear VR, but that's with the express intention of taking these headsets back to Medellin or Cocorná, just outside, and having a Spanish and an English version. It's really important, as we saw, Felix showing those versions, but doing what we can to try and bridge that, and hopefully leading workshops so that people can understand the means that we're telling these stories and how they can be shared. The idea was that by letting people experience other perspectives, that it might foster more of a sense of dialogue. In what pertains to empathy, you can see here these screen grabs. The idea is that it's fully interactive in the sense that, as interactive as you can be with a mobile, you can pick up objects. And as you pick up these interactive objects, it cues different pieces of media and encourage that greater sense of sort of engagement in the scene. So just quickly to try and define empathy, though, and I feel sort of nervous about doing this in a room full of maestros and specialists, but forgive me, those of you that do. This is old hat to you. It first actually was mentioned in 1909, the sense of a translation from Einfühlung, the German, the sense of feeling into, and that was Edward Tichenor. But what was interesting actually is Novalis actually built on this idea. He actually perceived the idea coming out of this sort of philosophical aesthetic approach as a process of poetic identification. So it was railing against this sort of the scientific nature of deconstructing reality into a series of empirical elements. And I think that's really interesting in light of the conversations and the presentations that we saw earlier today. And then last there, you can see Lips. Again, he brought it into the realm of understanding it as a basis for recognizing ourselves and others. And I think that's what's really fundamental as well, particularly when we move into dismantling this sense of how we conceive of this umbrella term of empathy. Everyone talks about, oh, well, VR and empathy are sort of, they go hand in hand. But there are actually different levels. So moving into my study as a Tau Fellow at Columbia, effectively what we're seeing is there are, as I mentioned, multiple layers. And these aren't by any means sort of cast in stone. They're more just ways that I've been thinking about to reframe how I'm approaching the results. So you can see here on the left, sometimes in terms of no empathy, it can actually be more operationally efficient to have a distance from the subject, right? Jumping over to the far right, people say, well, empathy equals good all the time. Actually, we found that complete empathy with a subject, particularly in traumatic storytelling, can actually create a sense of sort of mortal salience where people enter almost like a distress terror mode, and that only reinforces, their only way back from that is to effectively eject themselves from the situation, which can reinforce a distinction between us and the characters in the story who we're trying to foster a connection with. So in the sense of what is most, as I say, effective, this idea of emotional convergence, and people being able to physically understand other people, but at the same time be a little closer to them, I think is sort of the sweet spot that people are aiming for. In terms of how we're measuring that, this is a screen grab from one of the videos we're using. It's called, it's by Riot, a VR sort of predominantly 360 company. And basically, it's called Seeking Home, and it takes the story of a number of different migrants at the Calais, the former migrant camp in Calais, France. And effectively what we're doing is we're taking these different 360 video treatments and then transcribing them into text as a control, and then measuring people's different responses to them. So presenting the same information both in VR or 360 video as well as text. And then we're adding a longitudinal study to see if this impact sort of resonates longer and what it sort of looks like. So I'm getting to the end, but funnily enough, this slide is all about measuring. So ironically, in the sort of surplus of newspaper articles we've seen covering this topic, some people have said that our ability to yawn when you see someone else yawning is actually a vestigial trace of our empathetic roots, and that women also tend to be more empathetic than men. Jury's out on that one. I see a lot of nods. So in terms of the ways that we're looking to measure this, there are tests like the empathy quotient, the interpersonal reactivity index. A lot of those are themed or typically to do with autism spectrum research. Also, we're looking at skin conductivity because people tend to sweat and their heart rate tends to increase when they're engaged in an emotional situation and their states are changing. Expression mirroring is another thing that is quite, you'd imagine, quite a prosaic way of measuring your engagement with someone else, although it's quite hard when you have a massive bit of plastic locked on your face. And MRI scans, we've also seen, that can play an important part, but again, challenges when you have something on your face. So in terms of my last slide, all I wanted to show you were maybe some of the factors you want to be aware of as you're thinking about empathy in your experiences. So what I've been trying to do is create almost like a baseline, a baseline for how you might measure empathy in these experiences, and throwing in a lot of cool transitions in the process. So politically, it's been mentioned, I think, once earlier today, but a lot of these experiences do tend to err on the liberal side of things, and you do have access to, like, what's it like to be inside a Trump rally, for example, but it's not always the most objective. So that's something to be mindful of. Psychologically, when you're creating these narratives, personality types obviously influence the way that you navigate and negotiate space. So some people might find it extremely claustrophobic to be trapped in a room with someone when you're trying to foster an intimate connection with them. Physically, I still find it remarkable that there is this one-size-fits-all HMD format for people, and especially people who wear glasses as well. So, I'm sure, obviously, we're in the early stages, but these are things to be mindful of. Interpersonally, for those of you, for example, that have tried The Enemy, I was very struck by the height difference, just relatively speaking, of myself to the characters, and how that can play a huge role in our understanding of like the power dynamics that are unconsciously happening as we experience sort of reality and story. And so I wonder if that's something that might need to be negotiated in terms of influencing our unconscious biases. I know that 360 videos, for example, if you just arbitrarily place them at a certain height, it can have completely, again, that opposite dimension of looking down on a person, which creates that power structure that I mentioned. Paralinguistically, this is a really interesting point, and I encourage you to look at Katie Newton. She did a study, she's a Knight Fellow from Stanford, and she did a VR UX study looking at the amount of space available to users inside different experiences and the experience that connoted. So, for example, if you give someone a 360 freedom of reign inside a room and you ask them sort of what they're picking up on, they tend to drill, and this isn't fixed, but they tend to appreciate atmospheric input and stimuli, sort of picking up on things that might not be quite so tangible. Whereas if you narrow their focus deliberately, much like you see some of the config demo scenes inside these HMDs, to a single object or a table, then people find inherent meaning in the most insignificant objects. So anything that's in front of them, like the Chekhov's gun phenomenon of, this is in front of me, so it must be the key to unlocking this whole scene. So those are things to think about as well. And then last but not least, the chronology point is just the longitudinal aspect of this. So how long does empathy actually last? What does that impact look like? So what we're doing is we're building in a week and then a month-long check back with our subjects to see exactly, if VR or 360-based videos, and then later CG experiments, which I'm also going to be comparing and contrasting, do foster that sense of long-term engagement. So if you're interested, please email me. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan.